I had never imagined that a simple act of defending my property would turn into such a nightmare. It all started when I moved into my new home, a peaceful house at the edge of a small, quiet neighborhood. I had a nice, spacious yard, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my own space to relax. But soon, I realized that living in a neighborhood governed by an HOA, Homeowners Association, wasn't as calm as I had expected. In fact, it was anything but. At first, everything seemed normal. I was just getting used to the neighborhood and settling in when I noticed something strange. Every so often, cars would drive past my house and cut across my yard. It wasn't a big deal at first, just a few cars here and there. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. But as time passed, it became clear that people weren't just accidentally driving through. They were using my yard as a shortcut to get into the neighborhood, and it was happening more and more often. One day, I decided to stand outside and watch. Sure enough, a car came speeding down the road and cut across my yard like it was the neighborhood's access point. I couldn't believe it. I waved at the driver, hoping to catch their attention and let them know they were trespassing, but they just drove by without a care in the world. This wasn't just annoying, it was disrespectful. I didn't want anyone on my property without my permission, especially when it was causing damage to the yard. After seeing this happen multiple times, I finally decided enough was enough. I called the HOA to explain the situation and asked if they could help. Surely, I thought, they would understand and put a stop to it. But to my surprise, they didn't seem concerned. The HOA told me that since the land wasn't officially part of the neighborhood, there was nothing they could do. They basically shrugged it off. I was on my own that I couldn't just let it slide. This was my property, and I had every right to protect it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. After a few days of thinking it through, I started making plans to put up a fence. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for someone else to fix the situation. I needed something that would clearly mark my boundaries, and a sturdy fence would do just that. I spent a good amount of time researching the best way to go about it. I wanted to make sure everything was legal, so I checked with the local authorities to confirm where my property lines were. Once I had that figured out, I hired a contractor to build a solid gate and fence around my yard. I made sure to put up clear, "No trespassing" signs too. I wasn't about to let anyone use ignorance as an excuse. As soon as the work was done, I felt a sense of relief. My property was secure, and I was in control again. But little did I know, this would only make things worse. Less than a week after the fence went up, something happened that I hadn't expected. I came home one afternoon to find a car parked by the gate, honking its horn. At first, I was confused. Who would be honking at my gate? When I walked outside to check, I saw her. Standing there, with her hands on her hips, glaring at me like I had done something wrong. It was Karen, the most entitled neighbor I had ever met. Karen was part of the HOA board, and I could tell right away that she wasn't happy with the changes I had made. She was fuming. As soon as I stepped outside, she marched over to me and demanded that I open the gate. She didn't even ask politely. No, it was more of a command. "You need to open this gate now," she said, with a look of complete disdain on her face. I was taken aback by her rudeness, but I didn't back down. I calmly told her that this was my property, and I had every right to keep people off it. She wasn't having it. She immediately started throwing her weight around, claiming that she was on the HOA board and that this road had been used for years. According to her, I had no right to block it, that I couldn't just let it slide. This was my property, and I had every right to protect it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. After a few days of thinking it through, I started making plans to put up a fence. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for someone else to fix the situation. I needed something that would clearly mark my boundaries, and a sturdy fence would do just that. I spent a good amount of time researching the best way to go about it. I wanted to make sure everything was legal, so I checked with the local authorities to confirm where my property lines were. Once I had that figured out, I hired a contractor to build a solid gate and fence around my yard. I made sure to put up clear, "No trespassing" signs too. I wasn't about to let anyone use ignorance as an excuse. The contractor worked fast, and within a few days, my yard had a solid, high fence running along its edge. It was exactly what I needed. The gate was sturdy and locked, ensuring no one could drive through my property again. I was proud of my decision. Finally, I could rest easy knowing that no one could trespass without my consent. The HOA had washed their hands of the situation, so it was up to me to take control of my land. But little did I know, this would only make things worse. Less than a week after the fence went up, something happened that I hadn't expected. I came home one afternoon after running a few errands, ready to relax, when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a car parked right by the gate, and I could hear the horn blaring. At first, I was confused. Who would be honking at my gate? As I got closer, I saw a woman standing next to the car. She had her arms crossed and a look on her face like she owned the world. And I realized, it was Karen. She was standing there, fuming, clearly upset. Karen was one of the most entitled people I had ever met, and she happened to be on the HOA board. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't going to be good. "Are you the one who put up this fence?" she demanded as soon as she saw me walking up. Her tone was harsh, as if she was already accusing me of something. "You need to open this gate now." "I'm already late," she added, glaring at me like I had done something wrong. At first, I was stunned. I didn't expect anyone to be so brazen, especially someone who was a part of the HOA. It took me a second to process what she was saying. She wasn't asking me to open the gate, she was telling me, like she had some kind of right to do so. She didn't even give me the courtesy of a polite request. It was more of a demand, a command, as if I were the one who had no authority. I had no idea who she thought she was, but I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. I stood my ground, remaining calm, even though I could feel the anger starting to rise inside me. This wasn't just about a gate or a fence anymore. It was about my rights as a property owner, and I wasn't going to let anyone intimidate me into giving them access to my land. I replied firmly, "This is my property, and I don't want anyone driving through it. You're trespassing." At this point, her face turned red with anger. She couldn't believe I had the nerve to say no to her. She was so used to getting her way that my refusal probably felt like a slap in the face. She took a deep breath, probably trying to control herself, but then she snapped back. "You can't block this road. I'm on the HOA board. We've been using this access point for years. You have no right to stop us. I'll have you know, the HOA will hear about this, and you'll regret it." I tried not to let her words get to me. It was clear that she was used to getting what she wanted, especially with her position on the HOA board. I didn't let her threats intimidate me. I had done my research about property rights and HOA rules, and I knew that Karen, no matter how powerful she thought she was, had no legal ground to demand anything from me. She couldn't simply take what didn't belong to her just because she was on a board. I stood my ground and explained, "This strip of land isn't a public road. It's part of my property, and I have every right to restrict access to it. You can't just use it because you feel entitled to." She wasn't hearing any of it. She kept demanding that I open the gate, her voice rising with each word. "You'll regret this. You don't know who you're messing with," she said, pulling out her phone and dialing something. I'm pretty sure she was calling the HOA, thinking she could get them involved to bully me into backing down. But I wasn't backing down. It was clear to me that she was just trying to use her position to intimidate me. So, I stood there, unmoved, waiting to see what she would do next. And that's when things really started to escalate. The situation took an unexpected turn when Karen decided to escalate things further. Just as I was about to turn around and walk away, figuring she would eventually calm down, I heard her shout, "I'm calling the police. You can't block a public road." At first, I couldn't believe it. She was going to call the police over a gate that was clearly blocking her access to a road that wasn't even public? I felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. It seemed ridiculous that things were going this far. But I wasn't worried. I knew I had every right to stop people from driving on my property, and I had all the paperwork to prove it. Still, I was anxious about how the situation might unfold. Before I could even respond, Karen was already dialing her phone, and in no time, she was speaking to someone on the other end. She was explaining her version of the story, likely painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. I stood there, trying to keep calm, watching as she continued to shout at me about how I was violating some sort of community right. "You'll regret this," she said as she hung up the phone, giving me a look that could freeze water. Within minutes, 2 police officers pulled up to my gate. I had no idea how the situation had gotten so out of hand, but now I was facing the police. As one officer got out of his car, I walked up to him and explained the situation calmly. He looked at the gate, clearly confused. "We got a call about someone blocking a road," he said, glancing at the gate. "Is this a public road?" "No, officer," I replied firmly. "This is my property, and I put up the gate to prevent people from using it as a shortcut. The person who called you, Karen, was trespassing on my land. This is not a public road." The officer nodded slowly, but I could see that he was still processing the situation. He looked at the property map I had on hand to show him the legal boundaries of my land. I had come prepared for this moment. The map clearly indicated that this area was my property, and the fence I had installed was well within my legal rights. As he reviewed it, I could feel a sense of relief beginning to wash over me. This wasn't just about standing my ground, it was about protecting what was legally mine. The officer nodded, finally understanding the situation. "Okay, I see that this is private property," he said. "I'll speak with the other officer and clear this up with Karen." I watched as the officer walked over to Karen, who was standing there looking furious, probably trying to explain her side of the story. I couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but I could tell from the officer's body language that Karen was losing this battle. A few minutes later, the officer came back to me, looking calm and composed. "I'm sorry, but Karen has been misinformed," the officer said. "This isn't a public road, and you're well within your rights to block access to it." I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. Karen, who had been so sure of herself and her authority, had been wrong all along. The officers seemed to agree with me, and they were now explaining the situation to her. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't taking this well at all. She wasn't about to back down, even after the officers made it clear that the land was mine. As the officers walked away, Karen continued to shout at them, her face bright red with anger. "You'll regret this," she yelled. "I'll have the HOA take action. You'll all pay for this." But it wasn't just empty threats anymore. The officers were already starting to walk away, and the situation was slowly diffusing. I turned back to my property and felt a sense of satisfaction. I had stood my ground, and the law was on my side. It seemed like it was over for now, but I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd hear from Karen or the HOA. Sure enough, just a few days later, I received a letter from the HOA. They were asking me to come in for a meeting to discuss the situation. They mentioned that several neighbors had expressed concerns about the fence blocking what they still referred to as a public road, even though I had already proven that it wasn't. As I read the letter, I felt a sense of frustration but also determination. I knew the HOA had no real authority in this situation. They had no legal standing to force me to remove the fence, but I decided to go to the meeting anyway. I gathered all the documents I needed, property maps, photos, the police report, and even footage from my security cameras that showed Karen's outburst. I wanted to be fully prepared for whatever the HOA might throw at me. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I couldn't help but feel a bit nervous. I wasn't worried about the legality of the situation. I knew I had done everything by the book, but the whole thing felt more like a battle of wills than a legal issue. As I drove to the HOA office, I mentally prepared myself for whatever was going to happen. When I walked into the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. There were several members of the HOA board sitting at a long table, all of them staring at me as I walked in. The room felt uncomfortable, like I was the one who had done something wrong, but I stood tall and kept my composure. I spotted Karen sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed and her face set in a self-righteous expression. It was obvious that she thought she had the upper hand in this situation, but I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission. The meeting began with the board president addressing the issue. "We've received multiple complaints from the community about the new gate that's blocking access to what they consider a public road," he said. "Several neighbors have voiced concerns about the inconvenience it's causing." Karen quickly added, "This shortcut is essential for all of us. It's the most convenient way to get into the neighborhood. Now we have to use the main road, which adds several extra minutes to our commute. It's been like this for years, and now this gate is causing unnecessary trouble for everyone." I could see where this was going. Karen was trying to make it sound like the entire neighborhood was affected by my decision. She was trying to create a sense of urgency, as if I was some villain who had just ruined everyone's lives. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, though. I raised my hand, and the board president gave me permission to speak. "I understand your concerns," I began, my voice steady. "But the truth is, this isn't a public road. This is my private property. I've done the research, and I know my rights. This strip of land is mine, and I have every right to block access to it. If any of you had taken the time to look into the property lines, you'd see that the HOA has no jurisdiction outside of its own boundaries." The room fell silent. I could see the wheels turning in the minds of the board members as they processed what I had said. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. She shot back, "This is absurd. Just because you have a piece of paper saying you own the land doesn't mean you can ruin everyone's lives. We've been using this shortcut for years, and now you're just causing problems." Her words were growing more desperate, and I could see that she was starting to lose her grip on the situation. The other board members looked uneasy, murmuring to each other in quiet conversation. One of them even asked, "Are we sure this is even within our jurisdiction?" Another board member added, "I don't think we can force him to do anything if it's his property." That was when I knew I was gaining ground. The more I explained, the more the board members seemed to realize that Karen's position was weaker than they had originally thought. Even though Karen was still trying to argue, I could tell she wasn't getting the support she expected from the board. The president raised his hand to calm the room and said, "I think we've discussed this enough for now. We need to review the legalities and consult with our attorney before making any further decisions. But for now, it seems that we have no choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It felt like a small victory, but in that moment, it was a huge relief. Karen, on the other hand, was far from done. As the meeting came to an end, she stormed out of the room, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't over," she hissed as she left. "I'll make sure the HOA takes action, and you'll regret this." I didn't let her words get to me. I had stood my ground, and I had the legal backing to prove that what I was doing was right. The board seemed to be backing down, and I was ready to move on with my life. However, I knew that Karen wasn't going to let this go that easily. The following days were oddly quiet. I expected Karen to continue her efforts to make my life difficult, but after the meeting, I heard nothing from her or the HOA. It felt like a brief moment of peace after the storm, but I had a nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Sure enough, a week later, I received another letter from the HOA, and it wasn't good news. The letter was aggressive, demanding that I remove the gate and allow access to what they still referred to as the public road. They claimed that my actions were inconveniencing the entire neighborhood, and they threatened me with further legal action if I didn't comply. I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't backing down either. I had done my homework, and I knew the HOA had no right to make these demands. I wasn't going to let them bully me into giving up my rights. Despite the threatening tone of the letter, I felt more determined than ever to protect my property. The HOA had already shown that they didn't care about enforcing property rights, they were more interested in maintaining the status quo and letting people take advantage of private land. I refused to be intimidated. In the meantime, I kept a close eye on things. I checked my security cameras regularly to make sure no one was attempting to drive through my property again. I even reached out to a few of my neighbors who had used the shortcut in the past. To my surprise, some of them actually apologized for their actions and promised they wouldn't use the road again. They admitted that they hadn't realized it was private property, and they were understanding once I explained the situation. But not everyone was so cooperative. Some of the neighbors still felt entitled to use the shortcut, and I could tell they weren't too happy with my decision. However, I wasn't about to let that stop me. I had done everything by the book, and I wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of me just because they had been doing something for years. A few weeks after the letter from the HOA, I received a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Karen had reached out to her own lawyer and was planning to take me to court. She claimed that the HOA had authorized the road as a public access point and that I had violated some sort of easement by blocking it. My lawyer quickly assured me that there was no such easement in place and that Karen's case was nothing more than an attempt to bully me into removing the gate. It felt like a never-ending battle, but I wasn't ready to give up. I didn't want to waste time and money on a legal fight, especially when I knew I was in the right. So, I decided to take one more step to ensure I was fully protected. I reached out to a local news station that specialized in property rights and HOA issues. I sent them a brief outline of the situation, along with photos of my property and the fence. To my surprise, the news station responded quickly and wanted to interview me. A few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, explaining how the HOA was overstepping its bounds and how I was simply trying to protect my private property. The news team was incredibly supportive, and I made sure to emphasize that I had followed all the proper legal channels to ensure everything was above board. I also discussed how the HOA had ignored the concerns of other residents in the neighborhood, focusing only on their own agenda. The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. People were reaching out to me, offering support and sharing similar stories of their own battles with HOAs. It felt good to know that I wasn't alone in this struggle, and it gave me even more confidence that I was doing the right thing. A week later, I received a surprising phone call from Karen. This time, her tone was completely different. She sounded almost apologetic, which was a stark contrast to her previous confrontational attitude. "I saw the news," she said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "I realize now that I may have overreacted." She explained that after seeing the news coverage, some of her neighbors had spoken out against her and the HOA's tactics. It seemed that the public backlash had caused her to rethink her position. She admitted that the HOA had no real claim to the land and that she had been too aggressive in trying to force me to change my property. I was stunned. This wasn't the Karen I had dealt with just weeks earlier. She actually apologized for the way she had acted. While I wasn't about to forgive her completely, I could tell that she had realized her mistake. It was an unexpected turn of events, but it seemed like the situation was finally coming to a close. Not long after, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was a formal apology for their involvement in the dispute. They acknowledged that they had no right to interfere with my property and confirmed that they would no longer pursue any action against me. They even issued a reminder to the community that residents must respect private property and avoid trespassing. The letter also mentioned that Karen had been advised to step down from her position on the board. While they didn't go into specifics, it was clear that the HOA had recognized that they had overstepped their bounds. It felt like a small victory, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA. In the end, the road was still blocked, the gate was still up, and my property was finally safe from intruders. A few months passed, and the HOA moved on to other matters. Karen was nowhere to be seen, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace with my property. It had been a long and difficult battle, but I had stood my ground, and in the end, I had my rights respected. Sometimes, I still think back on the whole ordeal and wonder if the neighbors who used to drive through my property ever regret it. But one thing is for sure, they'll never be able to take my property from me again.